David Ruffin had one of the greatest voices in music history. It had a roughness to it, while also being tender at the same time. The great Marvin Gaye envied Ruffin's voice, thinking that it had a strength that Gaye's own voice lacked. Ruffin inspired both Bruce Springsteen and Rod Stewart in their careers. The Jackson 5 won their first talent show, singing the song My Girl, on which Ruffin sang lead. Along with My Girl, Ruffin also sang lead on iconic songs like Ain't Too Proud to Beg, I Know I'm Losing You, and I Wish It Would Rain. While he was only a member of the Temptations for about 4 years, he made a lasting impact, as he is the one who many people think of when asked who was the main lead singer of the Temptations. So with all this greatness and all these accolades, why was David Ruffin kicked out of the Temptations? Let's find out. Ruffin was born Davis Eli Ruffin in Wyandotte, Mississippi on January 18, 1941 to Eli and Ophelia Ruffin. His mother died before he turned 1. However, his father Eli quickly got remarried to a school teacher, Erlene, who had a good influence on the family. She was the one that was primarily responsible for the raising of the then 1-year-old Davis. His father's main job seemed to consist of administering punishment to his children when he deemed it necessary. While David said as little as possible about his upbringing, his older half-brother Quincy was more forthcoming. According to Quincy, Mr. Ruffin often used an 8-inch rawhide leather whip to deliver his punishments. Ruffin left home at 14 and kicked around in a few different places such as Memphis and Arkansas. He would also sing with various gospel groups such as the Dixie Hummingbirds, the Swan Silvertones, and even the Soul Stirrers for a short time after Johnny Taylor left the group. By the time he was 16, he'd made his way to Detroit. About this time, David's dad Eli died of a heart attack. Since David was still a minor, his brother Jimmy wanted to serve as his guardian. At the same time, a man named Eddie Bush and his wife wanted to do the same thing. Both men were attempting to hitch their wagon to what they knew was a good thing, hoping to take advantage of any fame that David might achieve. The Bushes would eventually become his guardians, and reports indicate that they would provide young David with a string of women to keep him happy and keep them in his good graces. His first releases were under the name Little David Bush. In 1958, songs were You and I and Statue of a Fool. Ruffin also had a local hit in 1961 with Action Speaks Louder Than Words. Around that time, Temptations had recently been signed to Motown with 5 members: Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin, Eddie Kendricks, Paul Williams, and Al Bryant. Ruffin and the Temps ran the same circles while performing and would often cross paths with each other. At one point, Ruffin told Otis that he wanted to join the Temps because of their popularity. Otis was impressed with David's skills and was surprised that he wanted to join a group when he was so great as a solo artist. Otis was right. Having the stage all to himself as a solo artist, David had cultivated a routine complete with moves that he borrowed from both James Brown and Jackie Wilson. Falling to his knees and pleading, breaking into full splits, throwing the microphone in the air, spinning and catching it. He was quite the showman. All this, and of course his voice, are what caught Otis's attention. David also liked the way that the Temps performed, and he calculated a way to get their attention. One night at a club called Chappie's, the Temptations were about to close their show with the song Shout. In a flash, David rushed from the crowd and jumped on stage. This song always drove the crowd wild, but Ruffin was intent on taking that to an even higher level. He grabbed the microphone and began to perform, as Otis Williams would recall later, like a man possessed. He sang soulfully and emptied his repertoire of dance moves. Ruffin's performance was so outstanding and astonishing that the group did 2 more encores. Meanwhile, Al Bryant attempted to battle Ruffin move for move with his own dance steps, refusing to be upstaged. He seemed to sense what Ruffin was up to. Finally, the Temptations left the stage, exhausted from their extended performance. The fans, however, still wanted more. And so did Al Bryant. "Man, them people want us on stage," he yelled at the backs of his group members as they walked toward the dressing room. Paul Williams, drenched in sweat, told Al that they'd already done the same thing 3 times. They were done. That was enough. Al retorted, "So let's do something else." However, the entire group kept walking away from him. In the past, Al hadn't been taken seriously by the rest of the group. Apparently, he'd made up his mind that it wouldn't happen again. Once he got into the dressing room, Al grabbed a half-empty beer bottle and drank from it. By this time, Paul sat down and was toweling away his sweat. Al glared at him and said, "MF'er, you don't believe I hit you with this bottle, do you?" Paul ignored him, which was a mistake. Before anyone could stop him, Al swung the ball over his head and hit Paul on the head with it. He was aiming for his forehead, but instead he hit him right above his nose. Blood squirted through Paul's fingers as he instinctively brought them up to his face. At first glance, there was a fear that he'd either lost one or both of his eyes to Al's attack. However, ultimately, he escaped serious injury by an inch, as the bottle just missed his eyes and the broken glass fell away from his face. He wound up with a 4-inch gash from the bridge of his nose to the tip. While the other 3 members had a meeting and decided they wanted to fire Al, Paul didn't want that. He knew the group was about to make it big, and that was more important to him than having Al kicked out of the group because of what he'd done. Al had an edge to him, especially when he had something to drink. Despite dodging a bullet and being allowed to stay in the group after his brutal attack on Paul, Al didn't act like someone whose career as a Temptation was hanging by a thread. Things would come to a head about 2 months later at the annual Motown Christmas show, which was held at the Fox Theater. This was an important company event because all the Motown artists were competing for the imaginary ranking as the most popular Motown act. The winner of this contest would be determined by the level of the fans' cheers for each performer, so all the participants were fighting to be the best. Temptations, who still had no hits at this point, still believed that they could beat more popular acts like Marvin Gaye, Lil Stevie Wonder, The Supremes, The Miracles, and The Marvelettes. Paul, the group's choreographer, fresh from his injury, came up with some new moves for the occasion. However, Al Bryant didn't take the contest seriously. He told Otis, who was close to him on stage, "Otis, we're the pretty boys. Let them guys do the work. We'll stay back here and look pretty for the bitches." Otis ignored him and moved to the front as the routine required. Temptations finished far behind the winners of the contest. Otis was angry afterwards and was ready to fire Al for this latest transgression. In comparison to assaulting someone with a beer bottle, taking it easy on a few dance steps doesn't seem like a fireable offense. However, truth be told, Otis had been looking for an excuse to get rid of Bryant for some time. In fact, he'd already gotten the go-ahead from the other 3 members if he ever felt it was time to fire Al. Now was that time. Upon being fired, though it was hurt, Bryant didn't argue or anything. However, he thought that Otis had it in for him. Otis retorted that Bryant was too self-involved to realize that he'd brought this on himself. The next morning, the group called Ruffin to let him know that he was now a Temptation. His ploy that night at Chappie's had worked after all. It just took a few weeks to come to fruition. Temptations now consisted of Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin, Eddie Kendricks, Paul Williams, and David Ruffin. This is the group that would become known as the Classic 5 Temptation. With David as a member, the group began to reach new heights. On their first official album on Motown, Meet the Temptations, Ruffin would appear on only one song, The Way You Do the Things You Do. However, the first full album with Ruffin in the fold, called The Temptations Sing Smokey, contained the iconic hit My Girl. My Girl opened new doors for the group and got them on shows like The Ed Sullivan Show, The Dean Martin Show, The American Bandstand, and Shindig. The song got so big that once, the group did a show without performing the song. According to Otis, the fans called them everything except a child of God for leaving it out. He also went on to say that they would never ever leave the song out of performance again. David was a singer at one point that every other singer wanted to be like, and he started to believe the hype. He had a crew of yes men, hangers-on, and leechers who were always around him. Ruffin was a man who craved constant confirmation of how good he was. This crew gave it to him. Papa, they'd say, using the nickname they'd given him. Papa, you was bad tonight. They'd also feed his ego by telling him that he was the Temptations and that there was no group without him. Prior to joining the Temptations, Ruffin said all the right things about what joining the group meant to him. He was very humble. However, once he was in the group, he began to buck against doing things that everybody else in the group was doing. Some would even say he was arrogant with his behavior. Ultimately, he began to see the rest of the Temptations as his background singers, with himself as the top dog. In one example of this, Ruffin hated to sing backup whenever Eddie Kendrick sang the lead on the song, and he didn't hesitate to let the other members know how he felt about it. In fact, once, while performing for a week in Bermuda, the group was treated like royalty. Accordingly, they were housed in a government-owned villa. For one reason or another, Ruffin and Kendricks got into a fight, one that featured Kendrick slapping Ruffin and sending his glasses flying. All told, the fight left the facility with expensive furniture overturned and holes in numerous walls. As a result, the government in Bermuda banned the group from ever coming back there. However, in spite of occasional dust-ups like this, with success came more money, and all the Temptations began to enjoy it. None more so than David. He purchased a money green stretch Eldorado, complete with mink seat covers and floor mats, and the image of his glasses on the outside of the vehicle. He also had a personal driver. For times when he didn't feel like showing off, or he just wanted to change of pace, he had a motorcycle that he'd speed around town on. For about 2 years, David dated singer Tammy Terrell, who would soon become famous for her duets with fellow Motown star Marvin Gaye. David spent lots of money buying the duo matching minks and sables, as well as matching gold rings and watches. Cracks in the foundation that was the Temptations really began to show up in 1967. Up until that time, Ruffin was free to do pretty much as he pleased. Often he would remain in the town that the group had performed in for days afterwards. However, as long as he made it to the next show on time, killed it once he got on stage, everything was okay. As early as 1966, though, David was dropping hints about going solo from the group. In 1967, once he saw that the Supremes became Diana Ross and the Supremes, he wanted to change the name of the Temps to David Ruffin and the Temptations. He once even performed an impromptu intro on stage this way: "I'm David Ruffin," then motioning to the other four members, "And these are the Temptations." However, Ruffin was smart enough not to try that move again. Temptations used to travel as a group in a station wagon and a Fleetwood Cadillac. That is, until David started to feel himself and began to travel in his own limo. He also felt that he should be paid more since he was the lead singer. He surrounded himself with people he felt superior to, like drug dealers, pimps, and prostitutes. As a group, all the Temptations indulged in illicit drugs, with weed and cocaine being the most prominent. Not saying that all of them used or abused these drugs all the time, as some used them more than others. Otis, for example, preferred weed. He dabbled in coke, but he didn't like the way it made him feel. He'd once performed under its influence and was too high to come down and do steps that he normally could do in his sleep. Eventually, Ruffin began to turn to coke as his drug of choice. While he hid his use from the group, his use still made his behavior erratic, causing him to begin showing up late or completely missing rehearsals. Even if the group knew where he was, he would either not answer the phone or just take the phone off the hook. When it started to affect his performance on stage, people began to tentatively try to talk to him about his drug use. No matter how easy they tried to make their approach, Ruffin would curse them out, tell them it ain't their business, and that he never embarrassed himself on stage. Ruffin thought he was invincible, and that there'd never be any consequences to what he was doing. Around this time, he started calling Dean Martin's daughter Barbara Martin his girlfriend. At this point, he'd separated himself from Tammy Terrell, who now was very sick with a brain tumor that would ultimately kill her in a couple of years. In Cleveland, Ohio on June 22nd, 1968, everything came to a head. The Temptations were doing a 10-day run at the Versailles Hotel. Towards the end of the run, David was a no-show for a Saturday show. They sent someone to his hotel to get him, but he wasn't there. The group found out that he'd gone with his new girlfriend Barbara to watch her perform at a club. As the saying goes, the show must go on. So the 4 remaining Temps went on without Ruffin. However, in the middle of the show, David showed up, came on stage. He received a rousing ovation, which he loved. He enjoyed showing up late and basking in applause while the rest of the group stood there steaming in anger. While Ruffin thought the whole situation was funny, that just made everyone else even angrier. Immediately after the show, Otis placed a call to Berry Gordy. He told Gordy the group was going to fire David. They also set up a formal meeting to make the firing official when they got back home. Meanwhile, they had lawyers drawing up formal paperwork to make the firing airtight. One reason they didn't want to fire Ruffin right then is because they didn't want to be swayed off their decision by him. He's very good at swaying and charming people to get his way. Also, contrary to popular belief, it wasn't Otis Williams alone that fired Ruffin. All 4 members of the group were in agreement, after his latest misstep, that David had to go. Also behind the scenes, Berry Gordy was pushing the group to fire Ruffin. While Gordy was normally gung-ho about jumping in and making decisions like this himself, he was surprisingly hands-off with the Temptations, allowing them to call their own shots on how to handle Ruffin. Cornelius Grant, the Temps' guitarist, musical director, and live show arranger, tried to give Ruffin one more chance to save himself. Grant knew that Ruffin was going to be fired, but Ruffin still didn't know. Grant thought that if he apologized to the group, he could still save himself. Sadly, though, instead of taking the advice, Ruffin got upset, feeling that Grant should have sided with him. In other words, Ruffin wanted him to agree that Ruffin was bigger than the rest of the group. He refused to listen to anything else that was said and walked away. This is the final nail in the coffin that Ruffin had constructed for himself. 5 days after the incident, on June 27th, all parties met at Berry Gordy's office. Staying in character, David was late to the meeting where he was going to get fired. By the time he got there, everyone had already signed his termination papers. When the papers were handed to him, Ruffin went through several stages of grief. First, he laughed, thinking it was a joke. Then he got angry, called everybody crazy. Next, he was asking them for another chance. Finally, he smiled, was very polite, said good luck, and walked out, all while trying not to show how upset he was. Otis felt sympathy for Ruffin, saying that David Ruffin wasn't a monster, he wasn't evil. I think he was like a scared little boy a lot of the time, and fell under the influence of truly evil people, leeches who fed on him. Otis went on to say that for all this craziness, David knew he was out of control, he just couldn't admit it to himself. Eddie and Paul were waffling with the decision to fire Ruffin, but not out of concern for him. They were afraid that without Ruffin, they wouldn't have a group. However, both Otis and Melvin were resolute in the decision and convinced them to go along with it. In the aftermath of his firing, Ruffin took it upon himself to inform his replacement that it was his turn to be a temptation, as Ruffin had, as he put it to his replacement, decided to leave the group. In typical David Ruffin fashion, he went to deliver the news at 3 o'clock in the morning. But who was his replacement? Ruffin knew that Otis liked Dennis Edwards and that he would be the man to replace him. Edwards idolized Ruffin and had worked hard to become his friend. In fact, had Ruffin himself not come to him personally to talk to him about replacing him in the group, Edwards might not have accepted, for fear that he might have been backstabbing Ruffin. To take this step further, at the time Edwards was dating Ruffin's former wife, Sandra. He asked for Ruffin's permission to make a move on the former Miss Ruffin, which David granted. As far as Edwards becoming Ruffin's replacement, it didn't hurt that not only could he sing, he was friendly, he was sunny, deferential, and well-mannered. Basically the opposite of David Ruffin. Sounds like the story is over, isn't it? Not quite. David wasn't going away that easily. Dennis Edwards' official debut with the Temptations was scheduled for July 9, 1968 in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. At this point, Motown had told the world at large that Ruffin had left the group with no further explanation. They left it open to interpretation as to whether he'd ever come back. It also had only been approximately 2 weeks or so since he had been fired, so not a lot of time had passed. But people wouldn't have to wait long to find out whether Ruffin would show up again or not. Unbeknownst to the Temptations, Ruffin had paid his way into the concert and made his way to the wings off stage. At the same time that Edwards was launching into the lead vocal for Ain't Too Proud to Beg, one of the songs that Ruffin had sung lead on, Ruffin was strong-arming his way to get on stage. Don Foster, the Temptations' road manager, was the first one to see Ruffin. When he asked him what he was doing there, Ruffin responded by slapping him in the face, then jumped on stage and getting Edwards' microphone. Right after Edwards had started with I Know You Want to Leave Me, from there, Ruffin started singing But I Refuse to Let You Go, and continued with the song as though he'd been on stage the entire time. Moreover, he acted as though he was still a member of the Temptations. Initially, everyone was surprised, and they didn't know what to do. Then Foster began frankly calling for security. At the same time, the audience recognized that the new figure on stage was Ruffin, and they got excited. As for Edwards, he awkwardly tried to blend into the background, singing vocals with no microphone to sing into. This is contrary to the way this scene was played out in the Temptations miniseries, where Edwards was shown having the mic snatched from him, after which he proceeded to stalk around the stage scowling. That was made up for the TV show. Edwards himself would point out this fabrication, saying, quote, "That's not the way it was. David didn't need to rip the microphone away from my hands. I gave it to him. I wasn't upset. I was happy to be there. My dream was always to sing with David Ruffin, and that night I did, even if no one could hear me," unquote. Meanwhile, the other Temptations acted as though things were normal, but also kept glancing at each other, trying to figure out what to do next. Ruffin will handle that for them. After the song was over, he left the stage as quickly as he'd appeared on it. The rest of the concert continued without further incident. However, Ruffin would repeat the same move several more times at different venues. Despite efforts to keep him off the stage, he still found ways to show up, perform, and then vanish back into the crowd. What was the outcome of all these random appearances by Ruffin? There are two conflicting sides to this story. Dennis Edwards says that the Temptations, noticing the crowd reaction and the fervor that came with Ruffin's random appearances, were ready to take Ruffin back. In fact, they told Edwards they were going to let him go and that Ruffin was coming back. The night Ruffin was to make his return, the Temps had 2 shows, and Ruffin was going to rejoin the group during the second show. However, according to Edwards' version, in usual Ruffin fashion, David was a no-show, and the group called Edwards back from the hotel to come and take his place with the group. Once the show started, however, Ruffin repeated what he'd already done several times at this point. Run on stage, perform briefly, then leave. According to Edwards, at this point, after being made a fool of by Ruffin again, Temptations told Edwards that they'd never take Ruffin back again. Now, on the other hand, both Otis Williams and Don Foster refute this. They say that Ruffin was never offered his old job back. Whichever one of these situations was the truth, this would be the last of Ruffin's surprise stage rushes, and both he and the Temptations would carry on in their respective careers. While Ruffin would have a good career after the Temptations, including the hits My Whole World Ended and Walk Away from Love, he never ascended to the heights he'd reached with the Temptations. Now, as for the Temps, they continued to churn out the hits with Edwards as the new lead, albeit with a new sound called psychedelic soul. Songs like Cloud 9, Runaway Child Running Wild, I Can't Get Next to You, and Ball of Confusion, That's What the World Is Today, were big hits for the group in the immediate aftermath of Ruffin's departure. Looks like Otis Williams is right. The Temptations were the lead singers of the group, and no one man was bigger than the group. We hope you enjoyed this look into why David Ruffin got kicked out of the Temptations. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, check out some of our other videos, and be sure to come back when you get notified of new content. Thanks for watching and see you soon.